Well, I'm excited to be joined today with Bobby Harrington from discipleship.org. How are you doing, Bobby?
I'm doing great. Good to be with you.
Excellent. Well, I've been fascinated by your website over these last few years. Why don't you talk about some of the resources that you guys offer for discipling folks in even this post-Christian world?
All right. Well, first, let me start, Eric, first of all, thank you to be on this podcast with you. The key thing I want you to know about discipleship.org is, in a short sentence, we champion Jesus-style disciple making. And our vision is the day when Jesus-style disciple making is the norm for families, for communities, for churches, and beyond that. That everybody, when they think being disciples, they think being disciples and making disciples. So we try to help people with this because we believe it's the most important thing to go back to in a post-Christian context. We're convinced that it's going to take more discipling than can be done on a Sunday morning program to out-disciple what the world is doing in terms of discipling. So you have somebody like Timothy Keller, who recently described that, in the Atlantic magazine, how people are on their social media bubbles for, 6 to 8 hours a day. And in these social media bubbles, they're being discipled. There's no way that an hour or two on Sunday morning is going to outdo that. And so our call is for people to go back to Jesus-style disciple making as a way of life. So we try to create resources and then bring together national leaders who can help everybody to put into practice Jesus-style disciple making.
I love that Jesus-style disciple making. It worked then, it can certainly work today. What are some of the things, and I know you're a practitioner as well, what are some of the things that you guys do in your church, or you're seeing in terms of trends among churches that are trying to help disciple folks in this very busy, harried, even online context?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let me tell you one thing that we did just before COVID kicked in is we completed a national study on disciple making cultures in churches. And so when you're asking what we're seeing, on the one hand, I have this mountain of research on the state of disciple making in the North American church. And on the other hand, I have this conviction about Jesus, like the way Jesus made disciples, combined all of the wisdom and understanding and brilliance of God in a human being. And so I find it very compelling, both what I've experienced and when I look at Jesus, to think there's no way we can improve on his method. And then at the same time, Eric, I have the privilege of having a front row seat with many of the nation's leading disciple makers. So let me sum up, and then you can keep pressing me. Let me sum up some things we're seeing. The first thing we're seeing is North American churches have not been very committed to Jesus-style disciple making. Less than 5% of churches in the USA we would call level 4 disciple making churches, which means that disciple making is the core culture. So less than 5%. And here's the scary thing. About 90% of churches the senior pastors are saying they're doing pretty good at disciple making because they make discipleship everything. So if the church has a Sunday school class, that's disciple making. If the church provides a service, that's disciple making. If the church sends missionaries, the people involved in doing missions, that's disciple making. And here's something, Eric, that I don't mean to be offensive, but a lot of people think that small groups are just automatically disciple making vehicles. And the truth of the matter is they're not. 95% of small groups in North America are not about making disciples. They're about gathering people, friendships, and various other things. So the state of the church right now in the U.S. and what we're seeing is there's got to be a table pounding call back to disciple making, and it's only been made more extreme, the need, by COVID-19.
Yeah. Well, that's a fascinating and telling statistic. And I think you're onto something, obviously, when you're talking about if everything is discipleship, then nothing is discipleship. Why don't you describe, I mean, you mentioned these 4 levels. Maybe I guess 2 different questions, but the 4 different levels of discipleship, I'd be curious to hear more about that. But also, how would you define what is Jesus-style disciple making?
Okay, those are 2 big questions. So let me tackle the first one first. We actually map out 5 levels of disciple making. And so I'll try to go through them really quickly. By the way, I want to encourage your audience to go to discipleship.org. There is a free assessment there, and you'll be able to assess yourself. So I'm going to start with Jesus. He's going to be level 5, Jesus and Paul. In fact, let me just say it this way. Jesus didn't just make disciples. Jesus made disciple makers.
That's good, yeah.
And the key function of level 5 disciple making is they don't just make disciples. They make streams of disciple makers. Here's the key verse for you, Eric. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, he said, "That which you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who are able to teach others." So it's 4 generations. You got Paul, Timothy, reliable people, to those whom they reach. That's 4 generations of disciples. So level 5 are people who are intentional disciple makers. They make disciple makers. And we argue that on staff at a church, for a church to really be committed to disciple making, that the role of staff and the role of leaders is not just to make disciples, but it's to make disciple makers. And that should become the key criteria in a disciple making church. Now, a level 4 is a disciple maker. So a level 4 is somebody who's a spiritual parent, and they intentionally get people in a group and they make disciples. Level 3 is somebody who helps the addition. He'll bring people or she'll bring people to a group, but they don't personally make disciples, and they're not making disciple makers, but they help. A level 2 is a person, and they're not helping and they're not hurting disciple making. They're just kind of neutral. And a level 1 is somebody, a false teacher, or somebody who's just an infant Christian who's totally worldly and influences people away from disciple making. Now stay with me, because you asked the question.
Yeah.
We have the same scale for churches. Okay. And again, on discipleship.org, it's a free assessment. You can take this free assessment. So in the United States, we only find level 4 disciple making churches. Internationally, we've got level 5. I actually know of a church in the Houston area that's on the border of becoming a level 5. So let me, again, I'll start at the beginning. So a church has a level 1 disciple making culture, and that's how we gauge it, a disciple making culture. A negative disciple making culture is where people are leaving the church, they're turning their back on following Jesus. A level 2 church is just plateauing. It's just maintaining. As many people are disciples today as they were a year ago. So they're not going down, but they're not going up. A level 3 church is they're adding. So you think subtraction, plateauing, adding, reproducing, and multiplying. So in a level 3 church, they're adding disciples. And the problem with that is they're typically adding them by programming without intentional disciple making. And as COVID's showing us, the results there are not the best. And in a post-Christian world, it's even going to get worse.
Yeah.
Now, level 3 church, they're regularly reproducing their discipling groups and their discipling leaders. Level 4 is multiplication. It's viral. It's so entrenched in the culture of the church that you'd have to work to stop it from continuing. Now, level 5 is the epitome of disciple making movements. And what we found in our research is there's about 1,000 disciple making movements around the world. And I can tell you about a couple of cool stories with some of them. but we can't find any true disciple-making movements yet in North America.
Mm. Wow, that's very helpful. And then to define, I mean, in many ways, I guess you just did that. The way to define a Jesus-style disciple
Well,
making person. Yeah,
actually,
go
I
ahead.
didn't do
Yeah,
that.
please. Yeah.
So it would be the operating system. When you say Jesus-style disciple making, what is it? Now, Robert Coleman wrote a book years ago, I think it was 57 years ago, Eric, that millions of people around the world have read, and it's kind of the gold standard on Jesus-style disciple making. Now, unfortunately, it's called the Master Plan of Evangelism,
Right. Yes.
because in the early 60s when he wrote that, that was the common terminology of evangelical Christians, evangelism. But it's really Jesus' method of disciple making, and he outlines in it 8 principles. Now, subsequently, we published an ebook with him. It's available on discipleship.org. It's called Revisiting the Master Plan. And Robert Coleman would add a 9th character trait that he said he just assumed it when he wrote the Master Plan of Evangelism. Now, we can talk about those qualities, but I'll just give you a simple shorthand. Jesus-style disciple making can be summed up in this short description. It's intentional, relational, disciple making or discipleship.
It's good. You know, it's interesting because those ideas, and I think this is maybe where the church has gotten off track at times, is even kind of breaking apart evangelism and discipleship. And Erwin McManus, when I worked with him, was consulting with the church, and they said, could you come and help us be better evangelists? We're great at making disciples, but we're not good at evangelism. And so he said, oh, well, if you're great at making disciples, then you don't need my help. And they went round and round. No, we need your help. And eventually he said, oh, so what it sounds like, if you're great at making disciples that aren't reaching anybody, then maybe you're not actually great at making disciples at all.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, and I love that you brought up Coleman's book and that you even offer that with a 9th version, because it is a very helpful, I think, understanding of what Jesus did. If you don't mind, just tell us one of those stories. You mentioned you found overseas some remarkable things.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just give us one of those.
So one of the guys that we have been featuring on discipleship.org, we have national forums before COVID hit, and then we're doing them all online. Yeah. In fact, I'm not sure, Eric, when this is going to be published, but this fall, starting the first week in October, we're going to be doing a series on holistic disciple making.
Oh, great.
It's a 10, 60-minute intensives where we just look at this whole topic of disciple making, and Shadonke will be a part of that. So I'm going to tell you about Shadonke. It's just one story. So he leads a movement in West Africa. I've got to be a little bit careful telling you some of the details, only because it's a Muslim dominated country, and they're trying to be a little bit safe in how they describe what God's doing through them.
Yeah.
Because let me just say this: Shadonke joins together with a group of people called in a part of New Generations Ministry. And this movement has seen more Muslims be discipled into Christ in the last 14 years than in the previous 14 centuries.
Wow.
And what it is it's the DNA of, they just think their job is to be disciples who make disciples. It's like they can't think of it any other way.
Wow.
And so the average person that you're going to meet sees themselves as multiplying groups and churches, because that's just like, they wouldn't envision it the way North Americans do.
Wow.
So they're committed to being disciples, and they're committed to making disciples.
Wow. Well, thank you, Bobby, for taking the time and all that you and your team does at discipleship.org. There's a lot of great free resources, a lot of other resources and opportunities. I want to encourage folks to go and check that out. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much, Bobby.
Oh, you bet. Great to be with you, Eric.